Hey everyone, Mr. Corrigan here. So, usually we begin the show with the Cristo Rey theme song, but due to the serious nature of this episode, we're going to begin the show differently. We're going to go back to that day, almost 2 decades ago, September 11th, 2001. Try to visualize it. The day starts like any other, no one yet realizing that the date, September 11th, will soon take on a meaning no one could have ever expected. It's 7 a.m., and on ABC, Good Morning America begins.
Today, jury selection begins in a critical phase of the trial of Andrea Yates, accused of drowning her 5 children. Plus, superstar Michael Jordan in the news, the strongest words yet from Jordan, that he will be back. Good morning, America. I'm Charles Gibson.
I'm Diane Sawyer, and it's Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. Michael may be back. He's saying...
Fast forward 1 hour and 46 minutes. It's now 8:46 a.m.
We want to tell you what we know as we know it. We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at the World Trade Center in New York City. One report said, and we can't confirm any of this, that a plane may have hit one of the 2 towers of the World Trade Center. But
16 minutes later, 9:02 a.m.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
I
did not see a plane go in. That just exploded.
We just saw another plane coming in from the side.
28 minutes later, President George W. Bush addresses the nation.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
7 minutes later, a 3rd plane hits the Pentagon.
The Pentagon itself has caved in from the top. There is much fire coming out of the windows. It looks like something from World War II, Peter.
22 minutes later, it's now 9:59 a.m.
Peter, it's Don Daler down here. I'm 4 blocks north of the World Trade Center. The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. Started with a gigantic rumble, folded in on itself, and collapsed in a huge plume of smoke and dust.
4 minutes later, 10:03 a.m.
And I'm just going to add to the chaos and the trauma of the day by saying that a large plane has now crashed about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh.
25 minutes later, 10:28 a.m.
Oh my God.
The second tower.
It's hard to put it into words, and maybe one doesn't need to. New York City has just been changed. And one has to assume that thousands of lives have been extinguished. Good Lord, it just...
Now, let's fast forward again. We return to September 11th, 2020. And here are your hosts for the Cristo Rey podcast.
Hey guys, welcome back to the 2020 Cristo Rey podcast. As one of your hosts, Nehemiah Clayton, with Brianna Blinkston. Today, we have a special guest, Miss Muchler. And unfortunately, today we're going to speak about this podcast about the events that occurred and went around 9/11.
Thanks for having me on the podcast today.
It is a pleasure to have you here. So we hear that you were a witness to the attacks that happened on 9/11. How was that like? What are you feeling as you remember today?
Oh gosh, there aren't even words to express what that day was like. And even though it's now 2020 and that day is almost 20 years ago now, it's still, every time September 11th comes up, it's just a really hard day. It was an intense day for sure. And for a long time afterwards in New York City, it was, the towers kept burning. They didn't just go out after, one day. And there were posters of missing people all around the city for months. I actually lived in an apartment in Brooklyn that had like a little back patio. And we found like charred papers that had floated across the river onto our back porch. And our apartment was covered in dust. And we were, a couple miles away from where the towers were. So to me, it wasn't just a day, but it was like a season. And things didn't get back to quote unquote normal for a long time.
This is Mrs. Abels, and when I heard what had happened on 9/11, I was in my middle school science classroom. I remember it was picture day at school that day, and so I could still tell you what I was wearing just because I have a photograph from that day of it, being the school picture. I remember the school counselor came into our classroom and told us what happened, and being in middle school, a lot of us were just kind of in disbelief or not really sure what to say or how to act. I remember a lot of students got picked up early, or a lot of students went down to the office because they needed to call home, especially if they knew someone who lived in New York or that was going to be traveling that day. So there was just a lot of commotion in the school building, more so than normal. I remember that evening at home, my parents just had the news on all night, and one of the things that I especially remember them talking about was the concern that there would be more attacks in the near future in other cities. And since we lived near Chicago, I remember being fearful that, and them being fearful that it could happen close to us. So that's kind of what I remember about the day. One thing that I remember about kind of the 9/11 impact is similar to now with us being in quarantine for the pandemic. Musicians and artists have come out with songs and things like that. That was a really big thing, and I guess because I was in middle school and music was especially important to me in that point in my life. But I remember Enrique Iglesias' song Hero, and they did a lot of interesting mixes of songs where they would insert little blips of things that President at the time, George W. Bush, would say the evening of his speech. They would insert little blips of that into the songs, and eventually they came out with this super heartbreaking song about a little girl who lost her father in the attacks, and her voice was played throughout a song and things like that. So that's what I remember about that day, and like I said, I could picture a lot of it, which is a lot more than I can say about some other days in middle school.
I just remember thinking the world will never be the same again, and will I ever feel normal again? And I do now, so that's good. But it was just really, it was really an incredible day.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. Now, you said that you lived in New York beforehand. What were you doing during that time? Where were you in that lifetime? What was going on through your head? What was life like before the attacks had happened for you?
Oh, that is a great question, Brianna. So I was working for a law firm, and the law firm was in Midtown Manhattan, close to Rockefeller Center and all that kind of stuff. So my life was being a lawyer. So I would get on the subway every day and take the train into the city, because I lived in Brooklyn. So you have to that's a borough of New York City, as you guys know, I'm sure. So I'd take the train into the city, get out at Rockefeller Center, go to work. I'd be at work for usually a long time. And then I was just kind of I was in my 20s, and I was enjoying living in New York City because it's such a great city. It's an amazing city, and it was such a fun place to live at that time. So I was just kind of doing that kind of thing. I had just gotten married, so my husband and I were enjoying our time together, and early in our careers and stuff like that. So that's kind of a little snapshot of what was going on. So yeah. I don't know if that totally answers it, but yeah, that's kind of what life was like then. Just early career and early marriage.
I feel like that's a good answer, kind of gives a highlight into early Miss Much Life. But I kind of want to touch on one of the points that you were talking about, how your daily routine was riding the subway just to get to work. I was going to ask, what were some of the changes post 9/11 that you had to deal with because of all the security measures and just all of the sense and height of tension and anxiety that went out throughout the city?
Yeah, so the subway didn't run for a couple days, which was really weird. So I was on my way to work when the towers were hit, and I got out of the subway and I looked downtown, and you could always see the Twin Towers if you looked south, and they were both on fire by the time I got out of the subway. And there were rumors going around with people on the street saying, oh, I think it's like a commuter plane. Nobody really knew what was going on. But by the time I got up to my office, there was a news report that the Pentagon had been hit. So immediately they like shut down the elevators in most of the, because I worked on like the 35th floor or whatever. So everybody was kind of evacuating buildings, and I got a hold of my husband and we arranged to meet in Union Square. And then we were walking downtown actually to stay with his sister for a while until we could safely get home. And we saw people walking uptown covered in dust because by then the towers had fallen.
This is Mrs. Carly Miller. On 9/11, I was in my senior year of college. I was eating breakfast in the cafeteria, and they had the radio tuned to a news station, and they were talking about the first plane hitting the tower. And at that point, it still seemed like it might be an accident. But within a couple of hours, word had spread, and we were all gathered in a common room of a dormitory watching the news on television. I remember spending most of the rest of that day trying to call my aunt and uncle who lived in New York City, and all the phone lines were jammed and nobody could get through to see if they were okay. And I'm so lucky that they were okay. So many people did not survive.
So we ended up walking home to Brooklyn, and after that, the subways didn't run for a while. And the first time that I went back to work, it's like a few days later, there were like bomb threats in our building. So we had to evacuate a few times. So there was just like a lot of anxiety in the city and all around. There'd be many times that once the subway started working, that they would stop and they'd say, there's a police investigation going on. We'll try to get your subway ride going again soon. And that would always cause people's minds to go to like, what's going on? What's happening? And then around that time, there was like a couple months later, there was an anthrax scare. So somebody sent anthrax to the mail room at Rockefeller Center or something like that. So it just seemed like there were always these, always uncertainties lurking around every corner, I guess is the best way to say it.
Can you speak on what anthrax are? I don't know if too many people are familiar with that, what those are.
It was like a powdery poison that is deadly. I'm sure Mr. Corrigan knows the history of this better than I do, but I just remember hearing about these anthrax packages being delivered around the country.
Yeah, it's even scary to hear just like you say the word anthrax. Like I didn't know what that was. I've never actually heard depictions of like people sending poison to kill other people in New York. So that's really interesting. And it almost like paints a picture of like how dangerous this whole attack was. Do you have like
those two attacks were not related? So that was like an instance of domestic terrorism, the anthrax packages, but it just served to heighten everyone's anxieties again, I think.
This is Mr. Lobster Lahant, and on 9/11, I was that morning a sophomore at the University of Toledo and was walking through the student union and came across a room of just stunned silence as students were watching the smoke billow out of the first of the two towers that was hit. The second one hadn't been hit yet. And we were all very confused, trying to figure out what it was and what it meant. And as I stood there, the second tower was struck by the other plane. And I spent the rest of the day, after I gathered my thoughts myself, in a friend's dorm room, just watching the footage over and over and over again, just stunned into disbelief at the ongoing events as the towers fell, as the people were fleeing the area, and not really knowing what it meant. Calling loved ones that were traveling, all sorts of things. But that was my experience of 9/11 now almost 20 years ago.
It's really crazy at a time when the country and actually the world was kind of shocked about what happened, that things are still happening like that. Because like you said, after that, your job had a couple bomb threats. Like even if those weren't the serious ones, then like why would someone take the time out of their day to do something like that, you know? If everyone's already on shock and just feeling nervous about what could happen in their daily life. Because I guarantee you, no one who went to the Twin Towers to work that day would have ever have assumed that something like that was going to happen.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. That's interesting. I was just thinking about exactly what Nehemiah said. I was like, and things must have never been the same. Like, you could be going to work, and the moment you hear like maybe a little rustling, or maybe you get an invoice from something suspicious, your mind immediately thinks another attack. Like, do you think that New York was ever the same after that? Or do you think they've made some like good changes after this incident? Like, is it possible to ever go back to a world before 9/11 for New York or the rest of the world?
You know, I think that we've been talking a lot about how living in this world of having COVID around has made us more resilient people and learning how resilient we can be. And I think that's definitely the case for New Yorkers. I think the city wasn't the same for a while, but I think it came back, and the people who live there are incredibly resilient, and we as humans are. So I think that, yes, we can always overcome.
This is Mr. Rose, 10th grade school counselor, and my recollection of September 11th was almost as if it happened yesterday. I was in college at Bowling Green State University, and I was exiting a telecommunications class on the second floor of the building. And as I came down the stairs, I recall looking to my left, and there happened to be a TV there, and I seen building on fire, which caught my attention. Of course, I went over to the TV, and didn't take long for me to realize that it was the towers that were on fire. And as we stood there, we actually saw the second plane go into the building, and as more people gathered around, we all kind of stood there and watched as the buildings eventually came down. This really stuck out to me because we were scheduled to play South Carolina that Saturday in South Carolina, and they were the number 4 rated football team in the nation, and we were playing under newly acquired coach Urban Meyer. And for some reason, we really felt that we were going to win that game. And because of the acts that happened on September 11th, that game was canceled as all travel was grounded, and we were never able to play that game. That day will always be in my mind. I don't think I will ever forget, the kind of place I was when this all happened. And it's something that I hope future generations never have to deal with, something so, I guess, earth-shattering, and something that is so monumental and so big that it literally stops the world. So that's my recollection of September 11th. And I appreciate all of the men and women that sacrificed themselves for the good of their neighbors. And it was a time that the whole country actually came together. And I hope that we can all come together again as we were during those times.
There's a lot of movies out today about the whole attack on 9/11. I know, like, in middle school, they had me watching a whole bunch of different types of depictions, like maybe thoughts about people who actually got to see it, thoughts about people who had loved ones who were actually in those buildings. Do you think those movies tend to accurately represent what actually happened on that day? Or do you think they're like exaggerated to any extent? Or what are your thoughts about those movies?
Brianna, that's a really good question. And I have to be honest, I have not watched anything about 9/11 since that day. So I don't watch any movies, or I think one time I sat down to watch, a documentary or a memorial show like 5 years after the fact, but I generally haven't watched any of those.
Yeah, I could understand that too, because it's pretty like horrific. You might not want to like relive anything that's like similar to that.
Hi, This is Mrs. Loffersweiler Hamp. On September 11th, I was in my freshman year of college. I had only been on campus for a couple of weeks. I had an 8 a.m. class, and then I was going to come back to my dorm room and sleep for a little while before the rest of my classes, because an 8 a.m. class in college can be rough. While I was lying in bed, I remember one of my roommates coming back from the bathroom. There was always a radio playing in the shower area of the bathroom. So while she had been showering, she heard about the first plane crash. So she came back to the room and announced it to the rest of my roommates. There were 4 of us living there. We got out of bed and we turned on the TV, and it was a rather small TV, but we huddled around it and began to watch the news to learn more about what was going on. Shortly thereafter, we received an email canceling classes for the rest of the day, which I think was a pretty big indication of this being a serious event, and that they were taking things very seriously. I don't know that initially of it that I totally understood how serious it was in that moment, but I think that began to clue us in a little bit more. We were young, naive freshmen in college at the time. So the rest of the day, things were very different in the dorm room, and in reality, I would say that this is probably a day where we made more friends among people in our dorm, and drew more connections among people in our dorm than any other day, because everybody was in their room. We all had our doors open, so we were all doing the same thing. We were watching TV. We were trying to understand what had happened and what was going on and how this would affect all of us and our loved ones. My dad had been out of town on a business trip. He works for the U.S. Air Force, or well, he did at the time, as a contractor. And so I had concerns about him. The young man that I was dating at the time, he had been my high school boyfriend, was stationed in Italy with the U.S. Air Force, so I was certainly concerned about him. I actually spent a large portion of the day trying to contact him and could not get through. Nobody could get through anywhere. It was several days till I heard anything from him about what they were doing at his airbase and how this may or may not affect him. So it was a sobering day, but it was, like I said, also a day where we began to build community in our dorm in a way that we never had before. On campus, I was involved in the Catholic Student Association. We shared an office on campus with the Muslim Student Association, and we were the only 2 organizations in this office. One of my strong memories from that first year of college and the year after too was making many intentional campus-wide events that were being run by these 2 associations together, the Catholic Student Association and the Muslim Student Association, making sure that there was a sense of support and solidarity for people who were beginning to feel alienated as a result of the events of September 11th, hoping that we could promote healing in our community as opposed to division within our community. That was something that was very intentional between these associations. So these are my memories of September 11th.
Well, there's also this idea around how 9/11 is a day that not only did it hit the Twin Towers, but it also hit the Pentagon. So, and all these other areas, what comes to mind when you hear that not only New York was hit, but other places were hit? Like, could you feel for those people who were also like in the face of these attacks?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the Pentagon was hit, and then there was a field in Pennsylvania, I think it was outside a town called Shanksville, that there were people on that plane that were able to thwart wherever that plane was headed. And I just think about, the people on that plane and the heroes that were on there that stopped that plane from who knows where that was going. So yeah, I definitely think about those places a lot.
So this is Miss O'Connell. I teach theology. I'm new here at Cristo Rey. I was in 4th grade when the attacks on 9/11 happened. The janitor and my 4th grade teacher were the only 2 male adults in the school, almost. So they were good friends. And I was sitting in the middle of class, and Mr. Rich barges in. He tells my teacher, "Turn on the news. You're not going to believe what's going on." He didn't really say what was going on. He just was like, "You're not going to believe this. Turn on the news." So my teacher does, and we sit there and we watch the news coverage of a plane flying into a tower in New York City. At that point, we didn't really know what was going on. So the time before cell phones, leaving school that day, the 4th graders were pretty much the only ones that knew that something was happening in the world. I think at that point, as a kid, I didn't really pick up on how this might have been intentional. I left school that day feeling sad and feeling confused. But when I got home, and as soon as I got home, I saw my mom cleaning. She was cleaning like that. She was clearly very scared about something. And that's when I got scared. That's when I knew something was really happening. And over the next few days, as we learned more and more about what was going on, my world got a lot bigger, and my world got a lot scarier. I remember my bus driver saying at some point that they were trying to scare us, and so they would probably attack schools next. And I remember watching the skies during recess, just looking out for planes and wondering if I would have to run away, or wondering if a plane was going to come crashing in during class one day. As an adult, it's kind of weird to realize that there are people who were not around or were not born yet when 9/11 happened, because I know that's a day when, it's a day when the world changed. The world got a lot scarier for everybody. And so realizing that there are people who maybe didn't experience the safety that I felt before 9/11 exist, yeah.
I was gonna say, to follow up, a lot changed after 9/11. For instance, our security measures and just our overall sense of what we take seriously here, what we don't take seriously here, what's socially acceptable to joke about, what's not. So I want to say, since your time post 9/11, do you feel as if the security measures that have been brought on by numerous administrations, both locally and nationally, have done enough to prevent another 9/11 from occurring?
I do, and sometimes I wonder if we've taken it too far. I mean, I think that we've definitely been able, a lot of the measures that have happened have been able to keep Americans safe, which is great. Yeah, I mean, there is a limit to how much you can do and surveil while also keeping people safe, but also allowing them freedoms and privacies.
The fact that I know they're really trying to prevent another attack, but there's certain measures. I'm not sure if this was a thing that happened after or before, but even just trying to get into America and become a citizen, the process is so long for a lot of people who want a chance to have a better life. And I feel like because of the attacks that happened during 9/11, they've made it even more difficult for people who don't necessarily intend to harm us in the US to actually be able to make a life for themselves here. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I completely agree. And also there's a lot of racism and stuff that happened after 9/11 that rose up that is just completely ridiculous. So I agree with you. Singling out of different people and subjecting different communities to unfair practices and just, yeah, it's been, I think a lot of the aftermath of 9/11 hasn't been all that fantastic for our country, to put it mildly.
Wow. I just want to bring up, like, kind of highlight what you just said. Like, you're someone who was a witness to this, and yet you're able to see that, like, there were a lot of negative consequences despite, like, the safety of American lives being put at risk, but also the downpour of it all. There's a lot of Islamophobia. There's a lot of just targeting various different countries and nations as this overall terrorist, like, actions and them supporting harming the lives of American people. And I think it's very special that you said that as a witness to this, because it's like, how can someone who was there, whose own individual life could have been harmed, have affected it, you know? But I just want to say thank you for coming here and sharing something that is kind of vulnerable, you know? I think that's one thing that makes a podcast as best as it can be, is if you have guests and you have topics that maybe no one can relate to, but they can understand. And I like how you were able to break it down for not only just me and Brianna, but the audience who are in the future going to hear this.
Right. Thank you so much for breaking it down for us. It's like paints a picture, like things that you never really would have thought happened during the time. It's like best to hear it from someone who's there, and like hearing your side of it, just knowing your thoughts on it. Like, even you're a witness and you like seen what happened to our country, but you can still say that racism is something that is very prevalent, and that they're blaming people who aren't necessarily, like, they're not there to blame. They're not to blame for the attacks if they didn't do it. And the fact that you can see that, even being a witness to that, and potentially like having, like, being scared about the near future is very interesting. So thank you for bringing this topic up and just sharing your thoughts and feelings on the whole topic.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me.
Mr. Corrigan here again. Before we end the show, let's go back to September 11th, 2001, just one more time. It's been a long day for everyone. The sun is set. It's around 7:30 at night now. The members of both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, are gathered on the steps of the Capitol building. They look exhausted. It's dark now. Several Congress people speak. The final speaker is Dennis Hastert, the Speaker of the House in those days. Now, I need to say that years later, Hastert was imprisoned for unspeakable crimes against minors. I in no way condone those actions. In fact, I condemn them in the strongest possible terms. But I include his voice here as a matter of historic record. Here is Speaker Hastert.
As a nation, as we said, our thoughts and prayers are with those families and those injured and those who are the casualties of today's attack. We also remember those thousands of people who are rescue workers. We ask now that we all bow our heads in a moment of silence and remembrance. Thank you.
And now, the members of the U.S. Congress begin to slowly leave the steps. Some have their arms around each other, some are hugging. It is the end of the loudest of days, and now there's a quiet moment. And in that quiet, the things that divide are forgotten. And unplanned, unrehearsed, unfake, Democrats and Republicans begin to sing together.
Sweet